The Democracy Forum brings you another not-to-be-missed webinar, The March Towards Global Hegemony, Undermining Democratic and Collective Responsibility Structures. In today's geopolitical landscape, the concept of global hegemony is gaining ever more attention. The rising influence of certain nations is fueling concern over the erosion of democratic principles and state autonomy, as this shift jeopardizes international cooperation and accountability. How do regional organizations led by autocrats bolster authoritarian rule? How are autocracies established and maintained? And what strategies can democratically committed parties adopt for resilience? Join our live debate to learn about these critical issues from our expert panel, sharing your questions and comments.
Hello and welcome. I am Humphrey, Hawksley, your host for this Democracy Forum debate, where often we give ourselves a pat on the back for examining critical issues overlooked by mainstream media and commentariat. Not this time. Our debate carries a sense of prescience that we were heading towards the violence and precarious uncertainty unleashed in recent days. The only question then was who would start it how, and now where will it all end, if it ever does. The march towards global hegemony, undermining democratic and collective responsibility structures. But who is undermining what exactly? The democracies or the autocracies or a mix of both? To unpick all this, we have exactly the right panel of experts: Hannah McHugh, Christina Cottiere, Jan Scholte, and Sebastian Haug. And to sum up at the end, we will go to the chair of the Democracy Forum, Barry Gardner MP, who will mark up the quality of our analysis. And before that, I have the privilege of handing over to the president of the Democracy Forum, Lord Charles Bruce, to give us the background and the canvas of our debate. Lord Bruce, the floor is yours.
Good afternoon and welcome to our webinar, which was conceived several months ago, but clearly has been overtaken by recent events in the Gulf. Within space of 10 days, the international community has been forced to confront the reality of a hegemonic world and all the unintended and chaotic consequences. I'm particularly grateful to all our panelists for accepting our invitation to speak today and to share their views with us at such a critical and alarming time. And I'd like to extend my thanks to the team at TDF for arranging this event and to Humphrey Hawksley for taking the role of moderator. Addressing the World Economic Forum in January, Mark Carney, the Canadian Prime Minister, reminded his audience of Thucydides' Melian dialogue, written 2,500 years ago, which defined the consequences for civilization of uncontested hegemonic military might. I quote, "When these matters are discussed by practical people, the standard of justice depends on the equality of power to compel, and that in fact the strong do what they have the power to do, and the weak accept what they have to accept." And he warned that the middle powers must act together, because if we're not at the table, we're on the menu. Indeed, the international system is no longer held together by a single dominant vision of order, as the European Council of Foreign Relations explains. I quote, "The United States is retreating from its role as architect and guarantor of that order, while simultaneously asserting its dominance through unilateral action and displays of force." In November last year, the United States government published a national security strategy predicated on two essential questions. What should the United States want, and what are our available means to get it? And it went on to justify its desire, I quote, "to field the world's most powerful, lethal, and technologically advanced military, to protect our interests, deter wars, and, if necessary, win them quickly and decisively." And 2 months later, it released a list of 66 international organizations it intended to abandon, claiming, I quote, "These institutions are redundant in their scope, a threat to our nation's sovereignty, freedoms, and general prosperity." Such a contention perhaps explains its deliberate obstruction and threatened withdrawal from the World Trade Organization, a denial of collective responsibility roundly criticised in a report circulated by the United Kingdom government yesterday, recalling how, I quote, the 19th century's global trading model encouraged rivalry between major powers, which ultimately led to armed conflict, adding, we risk moving backwards as we are again faced with a choice between the rules-based order or a power-based order. Indeed, this is the choice reflected in the hegemonic rivalry between China and the United States, as a paper published by Chatham House a year ago explains China's end goal, as I quote, a desire to create a Sino-centric global order in which China replaces the United States as the dominant state and reshapes the entire order according to its preferences. And there's little doubt that China is actively extending its hegemony through the Belt and Road Initiative, the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank, and alternative multilateral initiatives, including the Global Governance Initiative announced by Xi Jinping at the Shanghai Cooperation Organization Summit last year. Yet, as The Economist predicts for China, I quote, the dangers of overtly impeding American goals now seem far greater, but acquiescence would involve a big recalibration of Mr. Xi's global ambitions. Well, thank you very much for deciding to watch our webinar today. And if you have any questions or comments, please pass them to the panel through the chair.
Thank you, Lord Bruce. A choice between a rules-based order or a power-based order. Where exactly are we now? Our first speaker is Dr. Hannah McHugh, Department of Politics and International Relations at Oxford University and at Utrecht University. She works on a project called Visions for the Future that examines models that could replace or transform neoliberal capitalism. She's taught at the London School of Economics and has been elected as a London Borough Councillor. Among her many writings, From Oppressive to Progressive Praise, How, Why and When to Praise in Conditions of Oppression. In our current flux, Hannah McHugh, give us your thoughts.
Good afternoon. Thank you for the kind introduction, Humphrey. So democratic decline is often discussed in institutional or geopolitical terms, but being a political theorist, I'd actually like to start the discussion somewhere else and ask, what are the cultural and moral conditions that are making democratic decline possible, or for some, even attractive? In the UK, we're often using this phrase, left behind. I think it's now, in fact, so often used in political discussions, it risks explaining everything while actually clarifying very little. But I think it's a useful starting point because it does capture something real. What is often described as the experience of being left behind, I think could be better understood as a form of political disorientation. So to unpack that, we can consider over how the past 4 decades, our neoliberal economic structuring has profoundly reshaped our democratic societies. We've seen deregulation, privatization, weakened labour institutions, financialization, increasingly precarious work, increasingly mobile capital, and weakening social institutions. And the consequence for many citizens has been a growing sense that the forces shaping their lives lie beyond their control, and moreover, beyond democratic control. In a sense, I think that this feeling relates to truth. Our economic and social life is increasingly subject to globalized forces, but we continue to rely on national governments to try and manage them. So a question arises then, which is, why does authoritarian or increasingly illiberal politics become attractive precisely in this moment, in these conditions? And I believe one important answer is that illiberal politics operates as a cultural project. And by that, I mean it speaks to identity, to belonging, and to meaning in ways that the more procedural language, which belongs to a liberal democracy, often struggles to match. And through doing so, it offers people a sense of orientation rather than abstract rules. So to understand this in theoretical terms, we can begin by asking, what are the different moral foundations of these competing political projects? So for liberals, broadly conceived, the moral foundation of politics is the equal moral worth of all people. Politics will be justified to the extent that it respects individuals equally, whether we understand that as through equal rights, opportunities, outcomes, or something else. Illiberal traditions, conversely, start from a different premise. The collective comes first. So, for instance, the nation or the people is the first and most important unit of moral value, and politics will be justified in relation to it. Individuals will matter only insofar as they belong to the collective, and their rights will become conditional on membership. And those who are seen as in some way threatening the health of the whole can therefore be justifiably excluded. And I think this is interesting when we try to understand some recent political movements. So when we see far-right parties operating within liberal democracies, supporting redistributive policies, perhaps looking more left than the traditional left, what we see when we analyse that is that they're often advocating social protection for a particular in-group, those imagined as the true people, and the question becomes not redistribution itself, but who counts as deserving of that redistribution. And in conditions of uncertainty, inequality, and loss of control, authoritarian movements are offering something much simpler, a cultural story. They draw on myths about national identity, stories of a once unified people, a lost greatness, a community now under threat. And as I say, these narratives speak directly to identity. They tell people who we are and who does not belong. So in this way, authoritarian politics converts diffuse insecurity into directed hostility. Liberal democratic responses, by contrast, often sound very different. They tend to speak in procedural terms about institutions, constitutional safeguards, balancing competing interests, or protecting individual rights. And these are essential principles, but they land as technical arguments, and they rarely answer the deeper emotional question that people ask in moments of disorientation. Who are we, and where are we going together? So to turn this towards the central question of today's debate, I believe that the same economic transformations shaping domestic politics also affects international politics. Many of the challenges we face today are inherently collective problems: climate change, pandemics, financial crises, migration, AI, nuclear risk increasingly. And no one state can solve these problems alone. However, international cooperation ultimately rests on democratic political legitimacy domestically. So governments must be able to persuade their citizens that cooperation will serve their interests. And when citizens feel their governments have already lost control over economic life, they become skeptical of further or shared or pooled sovereignty. We can also look to the way that neoliberalism has hollowed out some of the tools which are needed to govern global problems. So financial markets now move faster than regulatory institutions, multinational corporations can shift profits across borders and evade taxation, and global supply chains often evade national labour regulation, while we have huge digital platforms operating beyond the authority of any single state. And the result is that states lack adequate governing tools. The global economy has become highly integrated, but the political institutions needed to govern it collectively remain weak. So we now have a growing gap between global problems and the democratic capacity to manage them. Authoritarian and far-right movements do not solve these collective problems, don't get me wrong. Instead, actually, they often align with the very private actors who benefit the most from neoliberal inequality, while directing public anger towards convenient scapegoats instead. But what they have is cultural arguments that land and resonate, and which lends them to domestic success electorally. So to resist these movements, what must be done? Well, I think two things are necessary. The first is material repair, which means tackling inequality, rebuilding economic security, and restoring democratic influence over the forces that shape people's lives, whether that's labour markets, industrial investment, or the power of global corporations. But material repair won't be enough. Democracies also need a cultural project. They must also offer people a sense of belonging, of shared purpose, and a credible vision of the future. We can't just defend democracy through abstract ideals like the rule of law and constitutional protections. We also need cultural arguments that give people a sense of belonging, solidarity, and collective purpose. The welfare state was framed as a collective promise that citizens could work together, look after one another, and that security and dignity would be shared, and democracy meant building a fair society together. We again need a sense of the future we are building together at the heart of our democratic politics. Thank you.
Hannah, thank you very much for that. That was absolutely fascinating. I'm thinking of this collective responsibility structure element that came in, which is, is there any initiative anywhere amongst the Western democracies that is redefining the electoral system so that it would produce the types of leaderships and institutions that you say are needed?
Well, I think that what can't be disentangled here is the cultural and the economic elements and how they need to come together. So I think that what we need to look at is how we create the democratic space in individual countries, domestically within nations, such that they can have a sway over the material, economic and social forces of people's life, through which they will then come to support these kinds of democratic projects. So I think a way to I think a useful way to understand, please go ahead.
No, I'm just thinking, we sort of identified the problem. We talk about democracy now as a sort of banner or a slogan or something like that. But the electoral systems, the way we choose our leaders and form our institutions, doesn't seem to have changed much, say, in the US or in Britain or in many parts of Europe. Is that the problem, that we're not modernizing the electoral system?
Well, I mean, we could certainly look to alternative electoral systems and see the ways that they also have allowed in some of these far-right groups. We have proportional representation in Germany, the Netherlands, Scandinavia, and we've seen similar concerns. I personally would be very reluctant to look at significant electoral change in a moment of such significant disorientation, because actually you risk embedding the very parties or the very ideas that you might like to avoid bringing in a kind of constitutional legitimacy. And I would come back to what I've said, that I think that we need to deal with this at the level of material and social and economic impact in people's lives, such that they can take up those democratic arguments. I do think in the UK that we have a democratic deficit within the parliament, which does not, and within the upper and lower chamber, which does not help ideas of trust and confidence in our government and a sense of being further away from power. Some of the ideas that have existed around reforming the House of Lords to be something like a Senate of the nations and regions, to look at Lords reform where there's a territorial basis, certainly could add a sense of legitimacy and a sense of identity and belonging within our politics. But something which I think is very beautiful about the UK Constitution is that it's always been a slow and evolving beast. And I think that it's interesting, we have some of the most advanced democracy, but we also have one of the longest standing monarchs. And that legitimacy relates to two sides of that. We need to have that cultural change and change that grows with people slowly, but also we need to make sure that those systems actually do speak to people's material interests.
Hannah, thank you very much. The cultural element is very strong in my mind as we move on now to Dr. Cristina Cotillero from the Department of Political Science at the University of Utah, and also works with the University of California's Institute on Global Conflict and Cooperation. Her research looks into international cooperation among autocracies, and among her many co-authored papers, one entitled International Financial Institutions and the Promotion of Autocratic Resilience, and another, Illiberal Regimes and International Organizations. Indeed, those international organizations that we have come to know and love, who runs them, and what does it mean if autocracies take control? Cristina Cotillero, share with us your thoughts.
Yes, thank you very much for having me. I want to start by acknowledging we often see autocratic consolidation as failures with domestic causes, right? So my research points to how international structures, specifically international organizations, can also actively undermine democratic norms and institutions in ways that are sometimes more subtle, but still very consequential. So I'll just highlight a few mechanisms through which this happens. So first, international organizations can normalize and reinforce autocratic behavior. Inspired in part by the history of the European Union, scholars in international relations have typically suggested that membership in more democratic regional organizations, meaning regional organizations with predominantly democratic member countries, supports democratic consolidation. But if we look around the world, in fact, a significant number of regional and multilateral organizations are dominated not by democracies, but actually by autocratic or liberal regimes. So some of my co-authored work shows that when organizations are dominated by authoritarian states, these are not neutral diplomatic spaces. So instead, these can become arenas where democratic contagion is actively resisted and autocratic practices are consolidated. So we find that membership in more deeply authoritarian international organizations is associated with higher risk of autocratization. And this challenges the older assumption that international institutions inherently promote democracy, or international collaboration is something that democracies have a strong advantage in doing, right? And autocracies are just not cooperative. So we see that's really not the case. And insofar as illiberal states shape the norms and incentives within these institutions, they undermine the principles that democratic states try to uphold. So just to summarize the first point there's nothing inherently democratic about international cooperation. So autocrats are also able to cooperate through regional and global international organizations to advance shared goals. So my research with co-authors also digs more into what autocrats are actually doing in these international organizations they control. So I'll give you a few examples. And that includes international economic and political collaboration. So my research on international financial institutions, mainly regional development banks, some of which are kind of offshoots of these other authoritarian regional organizations, dominated by authoritarian states. Again, these institutions are not neutral economic actors. So we find that they provide targeted support through loans and grants to autocratic governments, specifically in an uptick at times when those governments are facing more acute threats to their survival. So autocrats are using some regional development banks under their control to support themselves and like-minded governments in these moments of vulnerability to help those regimes withstand pressures that might otherwise prompt reform or potentially democratic opening. And that also reinforces authoritarian resilience globally. So autocrats are also cooperating through more purely political channels in ways that reinforce authoritarian stability. So with co-authors, I've also studied the phenomenon of low quality, phony, some people call them zombie election monitors. So international election monitors have traditionally served as key safeguards for electoral integrity, right? So these are groups that show up before voting begins, observing through the whole election process and reporting back on whether they observe any shortcomings in the organization of a country's elections, providing constructive criticism for improvement. So authoritarian regional organizations like the Commonwealth of Independent States or the Shanghai Cooperation Organization started sending their own alternative election monitors to provide low rigor validation of elections and to try to legitimize flawed or unfair processes. So this matters because it confuses the public about whether an election was really free or fair, and it tries to undermine the legitimacy of election monitoring overall. And when low quality groups flood the field, they create competing narratives about what constitutes a free and fair election. And so they're trying to help autocrats get away with rigging elections. So taken together, these dynamics illustrate how the erosion of democratic norms and the normalization of authoritarian politics is not just a domestic political crisis, but it's also something that's aided by these authoritarian regional networks and authoritarian cooperation in other global multilateral structures. So democracy or potential for democracy can be eroded from the outside in, shaping incentives, norms, and narratives in ways that we might miss if we're only looking at domestic threats to democratic governments or domestic sources of authoritarian resilience. So if we're serious about guarding global democratic structures, we have to broaden our focus a little bit and not just think about democracy promotion in terms of something that happens within countries' borders. So we have to be aware of this regional promotion of counter norms and counter structures that legitimize authoritarian governance. So thank you for having me. I look forward to your questions.
Thank you very. Given the events, say, this year, of the way that the United States is it still democracy good, authoritarianism bad? Or is it now more of a mixed? I'm thinking particularly of sort of recent UN not Security Council, General Assembly votes where the UK got voted down very badly over the Chagos Islands and Russia got voted down very badly over Ukraine. Things are much more mixed now, aren't they?
Yes, so at the same time that you have authoritarian regimes collaborating to promote their own interests, of course, you have a democratic recession in countries that we previously saw as the bulwark of, democracy promotion internationally, if you will. So certainly when the United States stops trying to combat some of what is authoritarian collaboration is promoting at the United Nations, we're going to see presumably China and Russia gaining ground and promoting counter norms.
And could I give you a question? Peter Cornish, who's in our audience, was saying, is it possible to build a global collective responsibility structure that does not end up mimicking the hegemony it tries to replace?
So I take it the question.
Well, I think it's sort of, we're talking about the global collective responsibility, which in a sense was the big idea when the United Nations was created and all those institutions that came off it. But if we try to reform them and make them work better, is it going to simply be another hegemony?
Well, I think that if democratic countries like, the United States providing a central coordination node for promoting more democratic, more liberal norms, if that's gone, then you will see a greater plurality in terms of perhaps norms promotion and that perhaps less of a global hegemony in terms of the acceptance of democracy promotion. So hopefully that gets...
And of course, I think that gets back to Hannah's point where she's talking about the switch towards culture and individual identity, whereas those global institutions were seen to be far more removed. Christina, stay with us. We're going to come back to everybody again. And just before we go to the next speaker, a very short break. And welcome back. Our third speaker is Jan Scholte, Chair of Global Transformations and Government Challenges Initiative at Leiden University in the Netherlands, and he's also connected to a myriad of academic institutions. One of his key researches focuses on measuring legitimacy of global governments and how authorities beyond the state gain approval. How legitimate or illegitimate is the world order we find ourselves in today? Jan Scholte, give us your arguments.
Thank you very much, Humphrey, and thanks very much to the Democracy Forum for this invitation. Good evening from Mumbai. I should say this reflects two changes in world global order. On the one hand, I'm in India, one of the so-called emerging powers. And secondly, I'm looking here at global internet governance, which operates more or less outside the United Nations system and multilateralism as we've traditionally known it. So perhaps reflecting some of the new trends in global governing. I'd like to question, in a way, our title. The march towards global hegemony suggests that we don't have hegemony now and we're moving towards it. And I would rather like to suggest that we've had global hegemony and we're moving away from it. The other thing is that it says, our subtitle says that we are undermining democratic and collective responsibility structures. This assumes that we had democratic collective responsibility structures in global governance, and I'd like to suggest that actually we haven't had them ever. So the undermining, we haven't had it before. On global hegemony, I'm understanding hegemony to have three features. One is that it's a situation of governing marked by a dominant power, so that the resources needed to govern are concentrated in a particular location. That dominant location, or that dominant power, though, is hegemonic also because it uses its predominance of resources to set the rules of the system. And not only does it set the rules of the system, but it tends to sponsor a system that enjoys legitimacy, meaning that it enjoys general approval from those affected, and so doesn't depend on coercion, manipulation, armed violence to survive. Now, I would argue that what we've had since the Second World War is a fair degree of global hegemony, concentrated where the concentration of power has been in the United States, or loosely called the West more generally. That Western US-led power has set the rules. The rules, at least the principles, were of a Western international liberal order. And you could say that the principles that were upheld were especially open economy, open world economy, the national self-determination as a principle anyway, and territorial integrity, human rights, humanitarian assistance, multilateral cooperation, peaceful settlement of disputes, and an open economy, in no particular order. But those were the, at least, lip service principles of a hegemonic liberal Western order that prevailed, as I say, more or less since the Second World War. And Hannah talked earlier about neoliberalism. One could say, yeah, that dominant liberal world order took a more neoliberal form from the late 20th century into the early 21st century. And I guess you could say we're seeing that both neoliberal and liberal world order challenged at the moment. Now, hegemony, I would say, is actually, we're moving away from it at the moment because we don't have an obvious dominant power, at least in territorial state terms. Lord Bruce talked earlier about China as a rise, but I'm not sure that we can really say that China, although there's been some sponsorship by China of certain rules, international rules, and new initiatives of global governance, in practical, concrete terms, they haven't gone that far yet. It's nothing like the sort of Western liberal order that was created after the Second World War. The rules, though, again, not only do we not have a clear dominant power, but the rules are kind of falling apart. And to that extent, Mark Carney's remarks that Lord Bruce mentioned earlier are on the mark. The rules are falling apart. Open economy, we're not having it. The rule of law, we're not having it. National self-determination, we're not having it. Human rights barely get mentioned. Humanitarian assistance can't even get into Gaza. Territorial integrity is being violated by various major states. Multilateral cooperation is hinging on a very thin thread. And peaceful settlements of disputes, well, I could barely get to Mumbai because the corridor between the Russian zone and the Iranian zone was a couple of miles thick. So in this situation too, legitimacy is very wobbly. And so, although legitimacy was never super secure under the Western liberal order, certainly in many parts of the world, the degree of cynicism, the degree of power politics, the degree of violence, manipulation, and war that we see today is really far greater. Anyway, just a concluding remark about the democracy aspect. Again, I'm not sure that we're in a situation of undermining democratic governance when it comes to global problems. If we look at global problems like climate, like digitalization, the internet, AI, financial markets, global supply chains, nuclear proliferation, cultural heritage, and other planetary problems, we haven't had democratic governance of those collective problems ever by any sight of the imagination. If democracy means that the affected people have due participation and control over the decisions that shape their collective lives, so democracy to me is not about elections to national assemblies. Democracy is about having situations and circumstances where affected people have due opportunity to participate in and control the decisions that shape their collective lives. If our collective lives are global around climate and AI and financial markets and so on, then democracy has been in a very miserable situation for as long as we've had globalization. And what we need is a far deeper reconstruction and reimagination of democracy than I think the electoral reforms that were discussed a little bit earlier in this discussion. Thank you.
And Scholte, thank you very much. Oh, those institutions that you mentioned there, the financial markets, the internet, that sort of thing, would they be better or worse off with democracy?
Well, democracy is one of the core values of a good society and human flourishing. So I would always say democracy is a good thing, but democracy has to be weighed up at the same time as distributive justice.
You're in Mumbai, where democracy gets a bit muddy. Or are we talking about accountability more than democracy?
Well, accountability can be democratic, but accountability doesn't have to be democratic. Accountability means that governing people answer to those who they affect. That doesn't have to happen in a democratic way.
Can I give you a question from Dan Krogan that has come in from the audience? Does the physical distance of global decision-making inevitably lead to the erosion of moral clarity needed for collective responsibility?
No, I don't think so. I think you can have very close physical distance to a mafia that is controlling your city council, or you can have through virtual online movements and mobilization. You can have quite a bit of democratic control over, let's say, the internet governance that I'm experiencing here in Mumbai. So I think physical distance often helps. And it particularly helps when people's political imagination is very territorial. But if you get yourself into a more global world, then I think you can be a little bit less hung up about physical distance.
Okay, thank you so much, Bert. Please stay with us. Very much enjoyed that. Our final and fourth speaker, Dr. Sebastian Haug from the German Institute of Development and Sustainability, where he researches issues such as where power lies, the Global South, the UN, United Nations, and associated trends, including China and power shifts in international organizations. China at the United Nations is moving into those institutions. So, Sebastian Haug, the march towards global hegemony, undermining democratic and collective responsibility structures, where does China fit within all of this?
Thank you, and thank you for the invitation. Many of the key terms and concepts in the debate we're having, such as democracy, are used across the globe. But the meanings behind these terms are not universally shared. I want to bring in insights from, as you said, work on the global role of the People's Republic of China, and I want to address three things: how China approaches some of these key terms and concepts, how China's interpretation of these concepts is reflected in its foreign policy and international cooperation, and the implications of all this. So let's start first with China's use of key concepts, and maybe most importantly, for our discussion, democracy, what Jan just said, is a good thing. So the Communist Party in China is presented as the ultimate representative of the people, and therefore the People's Republic is, by Chinese definitions, a democracy, in inverted commas, a socialist democracy with Chinese characteristics. There are voting processes at the local level, but all happens in the framework of the Chinese Communist Party. that is defined as a ruling party in the Chinese constitution. In terms of legitimacy, there's a strong focus on output, so social stability and economic development. And the Chinese leadership has been quite outspoken about its right to define what democracy is. And I quote from a 2023 white paper, "Democracy is not Coca-Cola. Trying to monopolize the patent of democracy is a pseudo-democracy." And Xi Jinping has said that, again, a quote, "China's socialist democracy is the most comprehensive, genuine, and effective democracy." So again, with a focus on that China and Chinese democracy allegedly delivers in terms of outputs. And Hannah has spoken about the illiberal foundations, and what we see here is a combined material and cultural project embedded in democracy speech, so to say. We see similar dynamics in terms of the rule of law, where the ruling party uses the law as a tool to ensure stability and development. And when it comes to human rights, the Chinese government underlines time and again that human rights are a domestic matter of sovereign states, so sovereignty trumps universality. And for China, the right to development is foundational for civil and political rights. When it comes to China's foreign policy and its international cooperation, China does not push its bilateral and multilateral partners to endorse the official Chinese understanding of democracy or human rights or the rule of law. And China tries to engage with all countries, irrespective of their regime type, in an umbrella of China-centered connectivity. At the international level, China uses the term democracy also in another sense, where it's not about affected communities per se. Democracy at the international level, from a Chinese perspective, is about intergovernmental inclusion, where all states are part of decision-making or consultation processes. And China claims to speak for the majority of developing countries and thus the majority of UN member states. And democracy at the international level then is for China a situation where China leads that majority. So what does that all mean? China does not push others to formally endorse China's understanding of democracy and human rights, but it does something that is potentially even more potent. It argues against universalism and it promotes a particularist approach to democracy, human rights, and so on. So basically, it is up to every government to decide what democracy means for them. And this particularist approach is potentially quite attractive to a number of China's partners and partner countries, and especially those with governments that are not interested in liberal democracy. And China uses its global initiatives on development, security, civilization, and so on to promote this particularist approach. In a forthcoming piece with a British and a Chinese colleague, we focus on institutional layering, how China uses what is already there in the UN system and elsewhere to try and add new concepts or adapt the meaning of established concepts. And just a brief example, the Sustainable Development Goals and SDG 16. For many, SDG 16 is an umbrella to talk about democratic governance, human rights, accountable institutions, and so on. For China, SDG 16 is about strengthening institutional frameworks that ensure the implementation of other development goals. So it's not about representative decision-making or public access to information or the protection of fundamental freedoms. In a nutshell, then, China promotes an increasingly visible framework for alternative understandings of key terms such as democracy and human rights. And we might see an incremental step-by-step process of potential normative change, where some of the key terms we operate with mean different things for a growing number of government representatives and other constituencies around the world. Thank you.
Sebastian, thank you very much for that. So just to get back to Hannah's reference there about the individual and the culture that was needed in our democratic society, China doesn't do that, does it? China does community and nation above the individual, is that right?
Yeah, so the focus is on the collective element of what society is about. So the idea that the government as a representative of the collective entity, China, in that case, is supposed to provide a framework for society as a whole, and then we can talk about individual rights.
Right. And given the current flux that we're in at the moment, that's been happening this year, is China being smarter than the West? In its sort of definition of democracy or definition of governance?
I mean, it depends on whom you ask, right? I think
I'm asking you.
I mean, and what I say is it depends on where you look at in terms of the global landscape. I think there's an increasing number of countries and people who are quite convinced that China's approach is interesting. and that it opens up space that wasn't there before because of hegemony, what we just discussed. So China is very explicit that it doesn't want to be a hegemon. It wants to have global connectivity that is dominated by China, but China doesn't want to be the policeman, take over that role from the US. They want to have that connectivity-based world where everybody, every state is happy or can do what they want in terms of democracy or whatever regime they want, but under the dominance of China. So a slightly different approach to normative credentials and the focus of how China sees the future of the world.
And a question from Ritesh Nigam in the audience. Does global hegemony today rely on coercion or the consent of civil society?
I think, again, from a Chinese perspective, civil society as such does not exist independent of the state. So the party state in China represents the society, including civil society. So this is a domestic matter of how the Communist Party in China manages to organize its society. And the Chinese, at least from an official point of view, assume that other countries do the same. So when we look at how NGOs are included in New York in decision-making processes at the UN, for example, the Chinese government really tries to ensure that government-organized NGOs from China or other civil society organizations closely aligned with China speak there, and not institutions that are more and more marginalized in China that are critical of the government. So the idea is that the state is seen as a unity represented by its government.
And very, very quickly, which international organizations has China got far more influence in than, say, it had 20 years ago? We've heard about the World Health Organization. What other ones?
I mean, across the board. If we look at the UN system, China is much more visible and present than it used to be 10 years ago, 20 years ago. And now with the US retreating from a number of international organizations, there is space for China to take. But it is quite likely that China won't just step in. For example, in terms of funding, China is not going to replace the US in terms of the main funder of many international bodies. China has its own logic of how it tries to coordinate and control some of these bodies.
That is fascinating. I'm going to give you a question from Philip Bowman, and then I'd like to go back around the panel, back ending up with Hannah on this question, and anything else you might like to add. Philip Bowman, can the panel comment on how the rise of technocracies, particularly in industrialized democracies, has led to a shift in the balance of power stroke influence? The rise of technocracies, Sebastian.
What is the rise of technocracies? What is a technocracy in this context?
What is a technocracy? I think Philip is he's not here with us. He is talking possibly about where Jan is at the moment. They're discussing how to govern the internet, and about Zoom, Google, these sort of things sort of running our lives more than any government.
I mean, there has been a massive shift, and I think Jan can talk about this. I think, again, if we look at China tries to make sure that this technocratizing trend is dominated by the government. So, and we've seen this time and again with big Chinese companies. At the end of the day, when push comes to shove, the Chinese government steps in and makes sure that Chinese companies are aligned with the Chinese government. Also because they see how in the United States, it is not always possible to control private interests. The Chinese Communist Party really tries to make sure that even though they subscribe to elements of liberal free markets, they want to control and keep that control.
Okay, that is great. Jan Scholte, can you give us your view on the rise of technocracies? I think you're with them at the moment, aren't you?
Yeah, but it's not only technocracies. I just wanted to raise this idea. Global governance, the governance of global problems, is not the United Nations system. It's not multilateral institutions as such. Multilateral institutions are part of it, but they're an increasingly small part of it. And so when we focus on the rise of China in the UN system or something, this is to some extent, if one looks at the core global resources, it's increasingly a sideshow. The United Nations may be bankrupt this summer by July, if things go as they're going now. So I think we do want to look at other places where governing of global problems is happening, and there China is not necessarily so strong. In private global governance, China is not particularly strong. In city networks, China is not very particularly strong. So the Chinese government is very traditionalist in its conception of global governance. And until it realizes better how the world is really being governed, it's not actually going to be able to be the great force that it wants to be.
And very quickly, just tell us what you're doing now, the organization that you're in Mumbai for, because this is a technocracy, isn't it?
Yeah, it's technocracy, but it's actually a place where technical people and governments and civil society and business come together collectively to make rules for governing the infrastructure of the global internet. And this is the model that one is increasingly seeing for the governance of artificial intelligence, for the governance of environmental problems, for the governance of health. The WHO is going down. Public-private partnerships are far more prevalent, and so on. I'm exaggerating the point to make an effect. Of course, the multilateral system isn't. But the problem is that people fall back on this assumption that governing global problems is the multilateral United Nations system, and that's really so far behind the times.
Cristina Cordero, do you agree with Jan?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's interesting also in this space that Jan's talking about, where China has made an effort to influence the ICANN and the International Telecommunications Union, which is more intergovernmental. But the problem, this is sort of anathema to China, these governing institutions where it's not one state, one vote. It's also private actors having a say, right? This is a huge challenge for them.
How does that differ to how the US sees this rise of technocracies? The US supports it, doesn't want to be involved?
Well, typically the United States, it's changing now, right? The United States today versus the United States 10 years ago stance on this, I would say, could be shifting. But typically, in the past, the United States was somewhat more supportive of this mode of governance because the biggest, most powerful technology private actors at the table were American companies that had a privileged position in these institutions, right? So even though this is not a statist, one state, one vote way of governing the internet, you have a disproportionate American say guaranteed by the fact that American technology companies are so powerful. So in the past, at least, the United States was in favor of this way of keeping the internet, governed in this other manner.
Unless you get a company like Huawei or something that's going to punch through and do. Hannah McHugh, how does this rise of technocracies impact the culture and the individual that needs to be represented?
Oh, well, thank you. Well, I think I'd like to answer this by referring back to the framing we had at the start of this debate, which is that we have this choice between power-based and rules-based governance. I think we also need to add into this choice that it's not such a binary. We also need to see the role of globalized markets and how they're coordinating both private and state power. So I think the rise of technocracy in many advanced democracies is actually very closely connected to the way that globalization has been governed over past decades. So one way to look at this, and I think a useful way, comes through Danny Roderick's lens, which he says we have this globalization trilemma. We can't at the same time have deep economic integration, national sovereignty, and democratic politics. In practice, we can usually have two of the three. And we're talking of these different countries, and what we're really seeing is different balances to that equation. And I think what happened in liberal democracies over the last 40 years is governments have gone towards deep economic integration while trying to maintain national sovereignty. And then we have to rely on more technocratic institutions to be able to balance economic decision-making and maintain that level of accountability. But I just wanted to pick up quickly on Sebastian's point and contrast that perhaps to the path which China has taken. I think it's very interesting that China has taken a very different path. So China integrated into global markets, particularly after joining the WTO, but has managed to retain a much stronger national control over its economic development strategy. But it's done things that Western nations wouldn't have countenanced. It used industrial policy, state-directed investment, capital controls at various stages. So in a sense, it's played hyperglobalization on Bretton Woods terms, which is something, as I say, Western nations wouldn't have countenanced. So perhaps the lesson for us, and linking to the cultural point, is that we don't want to imitate China's political system, which is authoritarian, but it does remind us that successful economic development means we need that strategic place for state capacity and economic governance, which in turn will allow us to have participation in our social lives, in our economic lives, and in our national democracies. So I think that the task for us is not just to choose rules-based or power-based, but actually to try and rebalance some of this relationship between politics and markets and see that as a fundamental part of our international strategy.
It's going to be rebalanced. We're going to have to find a time to rebalance it at the moment because things are in a bit of a flux right now. Hannah, thank you very much for that. The march towards global hegemony, undermining democratic and collective responsibility structures. It is time to bring in the chair of the Democracy Forum, Barry Gardiner, who is a member of British Parliament, steeped in knowledge about hegemony and democratic structures. How have we done, Barry? Give us your analysis.
First of all, Humphrey, can you hear me?
Yes, I can. Yes.
Wonderful. All the efforts that Vanita and I went to beforehand to check the sound, that it didn't make the mistakes of last week, have worked in that case. Fascinating discussion. Thank you to all four of our panelists today. Of course, Charles kicked us off posing what we thought was an essential question, and that was, are we going back from a rules-based order to a power-based order? I'm not sure that actually where we've arrived at suggests that that was the correct framing of the problem. And Charles talked about China actively seeking to replace the US as the hegemonic power. And I think we've seen some pushback against that, particularly when Sebastian was talking about China's interpretation of democracy. I love the democracy is not Coca-Cola. I hadn't heard that before, Sebastian. So thank you for that. I will steal that aphorism shamelessly. But this sense that China is looking at arguing that democracy does not require a universalism, and therefore democracy is whatever those individual countries wish it to be, but as you pointed out most effectively, under the dominance of China. It doesn't want to take on the policeman role that many of us in the West have fondly assumed America has had, but it does want to have the dominance. And you called that, I think, very interestingly, a particularist approach to democracy. I was taken straight back into my days as a philosopher with Nietzsche and perspectivism, and particularist approach certainly struck a chord with me there. And this idea that the society doesn't exist separate from the state. The state is a unity represented by its government. Again, it made me think here actually of Evans Pritchard and his seminal book, Newer Religion, N-U-E-R, the African people, the newer people. And of course, what that showed, that whole strand of social anthropology showed was the importance of that central defining religion, whatever it was, in all societies. And I think, going back to this post-Nietzschean argument, what we're seeing now is, with the death of God, what replaces God in that sphere? And I thought that chimed actually remarkably well with some of the other comments that had been made. Hannah McHugh, I found fascinating, Hannah, what you said. This growing sense that the forces shaping our lives are beyond our control, but also beyond our government's control. We look to the government to solve these problems, but actually they're not capable of doing it. And much of the shaping of our lives is happening within the social and social media domain. And the dichotomy you pose between the liberal democratic focus on the rights of the individual, the authoritarian focus on the whole, again, chiming with what we were just saying that Sebastian had talked about. The whole are permitted to sacrifice the inconvenient individual. Liberal democracy talks of process, but doesn't answer who we are or where we're going. Really fundamental questions which for eons the place of that was the function of religion, to answer that central question: who are we and where are we going? Well, if religion can't answer that, what then is left? Now, the Chinese answer is the state, the collective. That's why it is offering something that in certain aspects appears to be attractive. Christina spoke on the what are autocrats doing in international organizations and your examples. I love this low quality. I think I caught you correctly when you said zombie election monitors. I think that was the phrase you used, but if I'm not quoting you properly, then please correct me. But the way in which the CIS sent their own monitors to undermine democratic institutions where it wanted to push its own values and its own dominance. The erosion of democratic norms being aided by authoritarian regional institutions. And I very much liked what I think you were saying about the regional development banks. I think it was you that said that. Jan Scholte, now, I lost it, Jan, here, because you started off talking about 3 features of democracy, and I then wrote a very long number 1, which was a situation of governing marked by a dominant power with resources concentrated in a specific place, enjoying approval without coercion. You talked of the various aspects of human rights, peaceful settlement of disputes, territorial integrity, but I didn't get 2 and 3, and I don't know where 2 and 3 came and how I missed them. But my apologies if I've taken something here which was not what you wanted to say, but clearly I missed something. But the way you talked about moving away from a dominant power, but in China we don't see the rules falling apart. You quoted the Carney that Charles had referred to in the beginning, and the degree of violent politics. Not sure that we've had collective governance over the issues that impact our collective lives. I did wonder here. You see, I think if you look back, 11 years now to the Paris Agreement, that was, in one sense, a democratic collective governance over possibly the biggest issue that impacts our collective lives. But you spoke of a far deeper need to reform democracy and how human flourishing needs democracy. So I think we have a tension, I think, in what we've heard this afternoon, Humphrey, in that the role that the collective plays, the need to define who we are and where we're going, which is very much, if you like, the Chinese end of the spectrum, is at odds with this sense of what we would call the liberal democratic rights view, the process view of how we need to treat people and treat their individual rights. I don't think we resolved that tension but I did find it an absolutely fascinating discussion, and I'm very grateful to the panelists for it.
Thank you very much for that. And before I let anybody go here, I'd just like to go very quickly back around the panel as we came and give us your final thought on this topic, something that we can take away and remember. Hannah McHugh.
Thank you. Yes, final thought. Well, I think democratic legitimacy ultimately will depend on citizens believing that the collective political decisions which affect them can actually shape the forces affecting their lives and that they have a stake in them. So I'd like to remember globalization is not something that simply happens to us. It's something democratic societies can choose to govern. And so the task ahead has to be to rebuild strong democracies at home so that cooperation abroad becomes possible and also legitimate. Thank you.
Rebuild a stronger democracy. Cristina Cotillero.
Yeah, perhaps I'll just conclude by saying, just to summarize our conversations, we're in a time of great flux in terms of the potential winding down of the liberal international order, such as it was, and a time of heightened norm contestation, and perhaps China gaining ground in terms of promoting some of its favored norms. So I think we're going to increasingly see that international organizations are not the spaces of democratic promotion that we once assumed that they would always be.
Not what they used to be. Jan Scholte, that was your point, wasn't it? Give us a final thought.
Yeah, in brief, today's is a more global world, for all that populists and the like would want to deny it. That more global world needs new kinds of governing, which go beyond the nation state. And therefore the democracy that we create has to be recreated and more creative and go beyond the nation state democracy that we've known in modern times.
Love it. Sebastian Haug?
My final thought is democracy means different things to different people, and references to democracy can be used for very different geopolitical projects.
Thank you very much. This has been a brilliant discussion. I really appreciate it. I've learned so much. And thank you all, Hannah McHugh, Cristina Cotillero, Jan Scholte, Sebastian Haug, and thank you all at the Democracy Forum for making this debate happen. Our next Democracy Forum debate is at the same time, 2 p.m. London time on March the 24th. This one is entitled BRICS Through the Indian Lens, Intent, Impact, and Reform. Please join us, and until then, stay safe and goodbye.
The Democracy Forum is a not-for-profit organization founded in 2009 under the patronage of Baroness Nicholson of Winterbourne. Its principal goal was to work for the furtherance of democracy, peace and the rule of law in order to counter religious fundamentalism and intolerance in our global communities. In an increasingly fractured world, this goal continues to be the driving force behind all of the Forum's activities. Lord Charles Bruce is the current president of the Forum. Since its inception, the Forum has hosted and co-hosted seminars on a wide variety of topics relating to democracy and human rights across the world. The Democracy Forum encourages academics, students, journalists and other socially and politically conscious people to attend our seminars and to participate in the question and answer session. Details are available on our website, thedemocracyforumlimited.com.